Welcome everyone to today's AdvoChats. Today we'll be talking about import bans and what's happening in this area. We have with us Mathisha Arangala from Verite Research today. Mathisha, pleasure to have you.
Hi. Same here.
So before we jump right into the discussion, I just want to kind of set the context to this. Basically, as most of you all know, back in around April 2022, the government imposed several import restrictions in the form of bans, import licensing, etc. So the first set I think covered around 700 goods. And then throughout the years, both 2021, 2022, and even recently 2023, there have been various amendments, changes, some additions, some removals, so on and so forth. Now, most recently, again, the whole discussion on import bans has come about. So, Mathisha, maybe we can start off with you kind of laying out exactly what the present discussion is on.
Sure. Thanks, Avishka. So, as you have as we already we heard from the news and everything, there is an IMF requirement to prepare a plan for the phased out removal of import restrictions by June 2023. And according to what I have read recently in a news article, what they're saying is, so for instance, the Department of Trade and Investment Policies is saying that they're collaborating with the Central Bank of Sri Lanka to formulate sort of a roadmap for a phased removal of the import restrictions by June 2023, thus meeting the IMF requirement. And currently, however, we don't have access to any other information regarding this roadblock. But it seems like there is an allowance for, as even according to the IMF requirements, for sort of like a phased out removal of import restrictions. And if I'm to sort of you already gave like a short introduction to what these import bans are, but if I'm just sort of give like a quick rundown. So the import restrictions actually happen in in a sort of 3-4 ways, where primarily it was through import control licenses, temporary suspensions, and last year we also saw things like margin requirements on import and open accounting and a ban on open account imports. And the latest major gazette, as you mentioned, is the January 2023 list, which is like a consolidated list of all products which need licensing requirements, as well as which are currently experiencing temporary bans. And this list actually includes around 1,700 products at HS 8-digit level. And this is specifically with respect to the temporary suspensions and includes products such as vehicles, cosmetics, furniture, electronics, apparel, etc. And what we found was that these products actually account for around 11% of total imports experienced by Sri Lanka pre-COVID. And an additional 1,000 products require import control licenses, so which is an addition to previous requirements on ICLs, which were made like pre-COVID as well. And all these restrictions make up around 30% of total imports as of 2018 and 2019. And for this new consolidated list, around 1,300 new products were introduced and around 200 products have been removed when we compare it with the gazettes which were available previously in 2022 and 2021. So,
okay, now, yeah, when you put that into context, I think I heard recently the State Minister of Finance was saying they're planning to remove around 100. It's really hardly a dent in the number of all basically bans and restrictions are there.
yeah.
If you can take a step back for...
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Mathisha. Yes.
You can go ahead with the question. I can then make points.
Basically, if you can take us just a step back for a moment, can we perhaps revisit why were these import bans and restrictions imposed in the first place back in 2020?
Yeah, so at the time, back in 2021, like as we all remember, like leading up to 2022, the country was actually running out of foreign exchange to import even the basic requirements such as oil, gas, basic pharmaceuticals. We all experienced queues. We also saw news reports of hospitals struggling to supply medicine. So we were in a situation where actually we had to choose between putting restrictions on some products which were deemed non-essential at the time, to ensure that there was less pressure on foreign exchange for us to meet necessary imports. But so while we can say that it was a necessity at the time, there were many unintentional hardships. that people would have basically experienced because of this ban. So one would be the fact that many companies would have experienced restrictions on the amount of raw materials that they can import, the machinery. While there were exemptions, so while these products were put under the temporary ban list, there were exemptions made for businesses which do exports, which import raw materials and capital goods, which don't really, which aren't available locally. What we see is that these were inconveniences, especially for many small businesses, as now they have to get special approval and prove their value addition and things like that in order to import some of these raw materials. And even if we put raw materials apart, intermediate products apart, even with respect to final consumer products, what we can notice is some really unintended consequences with, for instance, if I'm to give the example of cosmetics, the livelihoods of many in the beauty care industry. The fact that there was a shortage due to imports being restricted and we had to rely on local production meant that the prices would have increased. Certain salons and all weren't able to rely on the best products. And in turn, a lot, like later on, like what we could have also seen is like these shortages and rising costs also resulting in a lot of these businesses closing down. And in turn, people losing jobs. And in addition to the business aspect of it, the consumers who were affected should also be taken into consideration, because currently we are seeing a lot of middle income families leave in the country. And one thing contributing to this could also be the sense of disillusion created by a lack of availability of certain products or the exorbitant prices of some basic products which they consider staples. And what's even more concerning is the impact on the tourism sector, where like many visitors to our country might not be able to enjoy certain basic necessities, and retailers and some of these malls which have recently set up who look to cater to tourists might not have anything to sell. And in addition to this, what we have realized is things like import control licenses or bans on open account imports can also have certain other unintentional impacts. For instance, especially import control licenses can lead to certain rent-seeking behavior and corruption where certain players might be disproportionately impacted. For instance, those who have already established contacts with government officials, large players who already know the system back and forth, who would find it easier to get some of these licenses approved when compared to smaller players, because they already know the system, they already know the agencies and the officials involved. And in fact, this could lead to a situation where rather than the imports actually reducing, there would be a change in who imports these products rather than the reduction in imports.
Yeah, so I think there was quite a bit there. I'd like to kind of jump into first the aspect on what you spoke about consumer goods. I think when the bans first came, there was a rhetoric around that, oh, it's luxury goods that are being banned, you're non-essentials. But in that example used in terms of the beauty industry and cosmetics, it's something you just think, okay, it's kind of a luxury good every day, but it has this huge impact on an entire industry. So I think that example really brought to light sometimes why a certain ban, like a blanket ban, can be problematic. I think, if I'm not mistaken, from the most recent numbers in 2022, we're still looking at actual consumer goods being around only 15%, and your intermediate goods are around 65, if I'm not, or 68, and then the rest are your capital goods or investment. Like you pointed out, even if we were to let's only look at consumers, even consumer goods have a value generating effect. And I think when you mentioned earlier how even the big items like vehicle only amount for what we would normally kind of categorize as luxury amount for a small amount, whereas you have things like, I think, petroleum and also textiles that take up a huge proportion of a percentage of what your kind of your imports are. I was also reading that. I was also reading, I think, an article you had recently written about GSP Plus and the apparel industry, and how sometimes it's important to be able to source these textiles from abroad to make sure you get that competitive advantage.
Advantage. That's also like giving the freedom, especially for the smaller players, like because like while there are exemptions, okay, the BOI companies would get exemptions because they rely on they import for exports and they already know what the systems are and they already have contacts with the BOI to get some of these systems. But smaller players would like who aren't used to the systems, who have to rely on the discretion of government officials to give these licenses and permits, they would lose out a lot. And the freedom to source imports is like really useful, like how like in the GSP study also, that's what we were talking about, the fact that through GSP plus we are restricted on the amount the countries we can source imports from. So that freedom is really important in order to make competitive products.
Yeah. One more thing in terms of why the government went for this. So I think, if I'm not mistaken with the timeline, it first came in around 2020, but we kept our exchange rate stable. But then later on, when it became severe, eventually we moved to like the floating exchange rate and it changed. What's the dynamic there in terms of, is it correct, or what would you say, where you resort to your bans first by trying to maintain that fixed exchange rate, or is there also an interplay where if you adopted a floating exchange rate, the rates would have kind of corrected to to kind of curtail your imports through that aspect?
I think so. We haven't done much. Like we haven't thought much into this, but there is an argument to say that if the appreciation happened early on, the demand for imports would have reduced, and there could have been like a natural correction. But yeah, like we have to look into the data and see how it would have really impacted. But definitely there is an argument behind it, because if we had appreciated the currency back in 2021, economic principles say that imports would have been more expensive.
So
And
just
as a
one
result,
final
reduction
aspect.
in imports. Yeah.
So one final aspect I want to just kind of explore in terms of how the government went on with this import ban. So let's assume that at that point it was really necessary. I mean, we were basically, our reserves were almost gone down.
Yeah.
But in terms of how we had gone about it, because there were several gazettes, several revisions. If I'm not mistaken, in August 2021, they came out with a gazette, and then soon after that, in August 2022, and then a couple of weeks later, in September again, they brought in a new gazette, reverse sum, and then you have the consolidated version. So there were just a lot of changes going on and on and on.
Changes, yeah, a lot of changes, and there were subsequent gazettes released where one or two products or three, like certain amount of products were the requirements were removed or certain amount of products were added. So it's only in 2023 we got a consolidated list with everything. But yeah, it is kind of confusing for people who want to sort of get into like international trade and try to start
Yeah.
trading.
Yeah. So I was thinking it from an angle in terms of your predictability, because even if you do have your bans, yeah, a businessman or anyone getting in the market wants some sense of predictability into, is this ban going to last, or next time I going to need a license for it. It didn't seem to have some kind of scheme. It almost seemed arbitrary at some point. So just wanted to explore whether you have any thoughts on that impact in terms of businesses and their kind of day-to-day functioning.
Definitely. So, like for some of these products, there were some discussions which happened after the decisions were made. Like, so, like I'm not sure to what extent what the date actually was. One example is smartphones, right? So, they were considering banning smartphones, but smartphones at a time would have been considered luxury good. But with the COVID situation, people were working from home, students were learning from home, and it was vital that people had access to cheap phones and like with internet access. And I guess the discussion happened and there was a lot of backlash against it, and eventually they sort of removed these things. So there could have been many instances like that where certain products might not have everything, but we haven't really done any like in-depth research into it to sort of give like a definitive answer on it. But there were, so one good example is the smartphone example that can come to mind.
Okay. Yeah,
So
thanks. I think
yeah.
Yeah, I think those practical examples kind of really make a lot of sense to you as a consumer or just someone who lives every day, when you realize, oh yeah, this is something I import and I use it for so many things I wouldn't normally, think about, like especially
Think
during
about it.
that
Yeah,
COVID.
because
Yeah.
especially like as consumers, we think of smartphones as ways to go on Instagram and things like that. But like there are proper productive users of smartphones, especially if you're a student learning from home, or you're a employee at a company working from home. So those would have really impacted the way we do business, the way we kind of maintained our competitive advantages, and those decisions should have had some kind of thought behind.
Just want to remind everyone that you're free to drop any questions you all have in the chat, and basically we'll take them up at the end of the discussion. So just to shift from, in terms of, now we covered kind of the context, how we got here, some of the possible long-term adverse effects, and like you said, the unintended consequences almost. In terms of when the government does release this plan, if I'm not mistaken, end of June, as per the IMF requirements.
So what they're saying is they're not going to. I don't think they're going to release the ban on at the end of June. They're saying they would get a plan forward.
Yeah.
With the phased out removal, like the plan for the phased out removal by the end of June.
Yeah. Do you have any idea in terms of what we can expect in this government's kind of whatever plan? Do you have a rough idea, one, in terms of maybe the scope of it, the timeline, and also how important is it to make sure they come out to make sure that they have a competent plan, so it doesn't appear, again, what we've talked about, where you have all this back and forth and kind of uneasiness and unpredictability?
So according to the news reports, like what I've come across about, like what the ministers and the different officials have talked about, what they're saying is things like electronic equipment, computers, mobile phones, home appliances. So they're saying that these are some of the products which are in line to be the restrictions where the restrictions are in line to be removed shortly. And what they are clear on is the fact that the vehicle ban would last for some time. And what the rationale is that vehicle imports amount to up to $1 billion, and in certain instances, like in 2018, it amounted to about 1.5 billion USD. So the concern there is that it would be a significant drain on the foreign reserves, and that is probably something we might not be able to expect anytime soon. And with respect to what we can expect from a plan, so what we recommend is like what should be ideal is it needs to be phased out. You need to think about a priority list and logically construct a priority list. So the questions that we need to ask is, for each product, is saving the foreign exchange with respect to this product more beneficial than the sacrifices for domestic production or consumers, right? And in that way, so we need to look into the products which would have the biggest pressure on BOP, and which is going to create a massive outflow in the short term, and sort of think about phasing those out over a period of time. But at the same time, we also need to think about the well-being of the consumers and the businesses with respect to some of the other consumer products which we are considering. So I think I saw an article about the president quoting that essential goods, medicine, and material required for the tourism sector will be included in the first round of the removal of the restrictions. So it will be interesting to see. So while import bans are definitely bad, considering the current situation we are in, we need to think about a way in which we are managing the removal of these things in a way in which it won't bring any short-term shocks, which we won't be able to manage.
Okay, understood. Just to kind of follow up on that, when this is kind of phased out, whatever priority list, what about these exceptions that you were talking about? How should the government approach this? Should they still kind of maintain these exemptions, or if they go product by product, do you think whatever manner, do you think there needs to be some kind of also phasing out of these to make sure everyone has access to whatever products that come in?
Yeah, so the exemptions are like what I saw with respect to, so for instance, with respect to the example of the 2023 consolidated list for temporary bans, temporary suspensions of products, what the exemptions are usually for companies who sort of export through the BOI, through the TEEP scheme, for exporting, who import products for to be used as raw materials for exports. They have certain leeways, as well as those who import raw materials which are not available in Sri Lanka. But in this case, they have to prove a certain value addition, about 35% or 20% for some products, in order to get these restrictions. So there is a considerable inconvenience there, because you have to sort of go to officials and get the documentation in place to sort of prove these things. And it's worthwhile considering sort of some of those products which are really vital, instead of I guess putting in these exemptions, to sort of think about removing the bans completely. So as I said, it's a matter of us considering what we are giving up with respect to this thing. So is saving the foreign exchange for those products more beneficial than what the impact on the domestic production will be?
Yeah. So there's always kind of a trade-off involved in
Yeah.
whatever kind of policy decision you do there.
Yes.
So shifting a little bit more into the longer term or medium to longer term, what do you kind of expect after? Let's say we have moved to the final stage of removing all the bans. And after that, how does the government kind of approach this issue in terms of, one, do they need to come up with a mechanism to make sure they don't have to resort to, again, kind of these import bans? To because you're basically opening up your markets and imports are going to come in, how does this play into your kind of tariff structure there?
So yeah, it's I guess it's a question about like trade liberalization in general, right? So I guess when it comes to trade liberalization, so what we have seen is, like, in Sri Lanka's context, it's mainly about removing cess and our para tariffs, and also in a way reducing some of the customs duty as well. But it's mostly because we have at certain stages opted to remove customs duty. We have FTAs with different countries and these things which focus on customs duty, but Sri Lanka is a country which have these additional tariffs in place in addition to the WTO mandated customs duty, such as cess, PAL, SCL, etc. And any sort of tariff liberalization would dwell around removing some of these things. And why some of these para tariffs are kind of really detrimental is that one thing is that these tariffs sort of undermine our existing trade agreements, right? So for instance, if we have a trade agreement with India and we have opted to reduce the import duties on certain products, there's no point, we won't really garner any benefit out of it, or we won't see the full impact of these things, and it will also undermine our Sri Lanka's side of things when negotiating with India if we sort of put Parat, CES and PAL and SCL on top of that, right? So in addition to that, it's all about the simplicity, right? Having a single rate, even high for now, contributes much more to the simplicity of the tariff regime, increasing the attractiveness of international trade to people who want to get into the business, as well as like also facilitating foreign investment. And it can also help reduce the government's discretion in just putting introducing tariffs at however they want, introducing new tariff codes and introducing new para tariffs, cess and at their discretion. So if I'm to give like a sort of history on like our experience with trade liberalization, so over the last few years, there have been several discussions about phasing out the removal of cess and other para tariffs. And what we saw is, like, prior to COVID, several budget speeches have also mentioned this. But despite these multiple attempts, it hasn't really materialized into a specific trade policy initiative, right? And obviously, what we are also saying is that such liberalization should not happen instantly. Shock therapy is never recommended, but the government should always consider the impact on local businesses and employment and phase out the liberalization in a way in which it minimizes such impacts on vulnerable businesses and vulnerable employees in vulnerable employees in vulnerable sectors. But the problem is, even the question about phasing out is still unclear, right? There is no clear policy sort of policy on removing these tariffs. So what we recommend is, okay, you have to sort of remove these para tariffs, combine them or whatever, But in order to do that, you need to sort of look into phase it out in a way in which it will minimize some of the impact on the businesses and employment. And we do recommend things like trade adjustment packages, right, to sort of assist affected firms and employees. And these have been done in many countries, including the US, Korea, South Korea, and places like Mexico, when they at one point in their history attempted to remove most of these restriction protectionism measures. So what we are recommending is, if we are to go into such an initiative, we need to be looking into things like trade packages, where we look into identifying some of these vulnerable sectors. So the vulnerable sectors would be those sectors which already have high tariffs in place. And within these vulnerable sectors, to identify vulnerable firms and vulnerable employees, people who have the potential of losing their jobs. So identifying certain criteria such as gender, location, whether they are urban or rural, age, skills, and see, okay, who will be most affected, who will need the assistance to sort of take on the hit.
Thanks, Mathish, for that. I think that really gave a good overview in terms of what's next after kind of the bans. Just like to remind everyone, if you all have any questions, you can just drop it in the chat and we'll basically take them up. Now, just to move back to an initial comment you made and also connected with something you said at the end, in terms of when you have the ban, how it can affect consumers. And I suppose this also ties into the question of why you want to kind of remove this cess and PAL. Would you essentially see some of the same benefits there, where you have better accessibility as consumers, your lower cost for some products, for basically people who won't be exporting and being able to obtain them? So does removing these cess, PAL, these para tariffs kind of reduce your cost? So you've got accessibility since the bans are removed, but then would it also reduce costs, and it takes you that extra step of being more competitive from that angle?
Definitely, because like as I said, there is a aspect of so obviously if you reduce the tariffs, it does encourage more trade, which is always good for the consumers as well as certain things, right? The competition will make businesses more competitive, so those arguments are there. But definitely there will be an element of us trading. Yeah, so the direct cost would be reduced, and mostly it's about reducing the, because the customs duty is like it's what's visible to the world, right? The para tariffs are transparent. No, like not many, people don't really, unless like even investors, foreign investors, unless they look into Sri Lanka's tariff guides and things like that, they wouldn't even know that these para tariffs exist, which are solely for imports, right? If they go to the WTO databases and all, they'll just see the customs duty, and even our free trade agreements and all are focused on customs duty. So it is important to reduce this, increase the reduce this kind of this thing from the perspective of simplicity, as well as to make our country more attractive to this thing, in addition to the benefits that it can bring our businesses and consumers.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you had mentioned in terms of the trade adjustment, I think that's an important point you raised, to make sure kind of the shocks or the negative that would hit a particular industry are basically mitigated. And also, I suppose to an extent, that is to get their buy-in, because reforms
Yes,
can be
definitely.
hard. And
yes,
yeah,
because
and
yeah, definitely.
yeah, go ahead, Mathish.
No, that I was like affirming what you said, because
Yeah.
there is a lot of resistance to trade limit because of the fear. It's a natural fear of imports coming in and these things. So you need to sort of soften the blow with respect to these things, and trade adjustment packages have proven to sort of be effective in that sense.
So that was actually got me thinking along the lines in terms of there's pushback when back then, before the bans came in terms of general liberalization. Do you think there might be pushback in terms of the liberalization of or the removal of these bans, or these the import licensing schemes? Because currently, right now, I assume there is some degree of, let's say, maybe market capture of players that have been able to access these, and more often than not, because it's involved in a government bureaucracy, it's either established players or through a connection or something like that. Do you think there might be pushback on this because there are people currently maybe benefiting from the existing schemes?
Yes, definitely there would be, but we need to look at the country as a whole, right? When it comes to these things, so there are certain vested interests when it comes to anything, even with respect to trade facilitation efforts and things like that. We have seen that there are parties who would be benefiting, but then we need to look into the other, like the vast majority of businesses and all, which are hoping to come into the industry, who might feel like who might face a lot of barriers to entry because of such huge these things like licenses, huge tariffs, complex tariffs, discretion with respect to changes with change like ad hoc changes to tariff rates and other regulations, and lack of simplicity with respect to trading. So that's where trade facilitation comes in.
Yeah. So I think taking some main themes are basically from what we've covered, I think one important thing is you look at almost a trade-off, a cost-benefit analysis, where you see when you have these kind of bans in place or when you're removing it, what are the fiscal impacts versus the consequences across the economy. Two, I think, is almost a transparency or predictability, making sure there's a sense of uniformity with whatever the government does and whatever the government kind of goes about. And then I suppose it's overall kind of management of your trade policy to how it interplays and make sure you don't get to the point where you need like these extreme kind of import bans. And even then when you do, can you do opt for one, there's a good rationale behind it. It's backed by proper research to kind of see what possible effects it could have. Is there anything else you kind of just want to add onto the topic before we wrap up?
Not, I think I have covered everything that I wanted to say, but yeah, it's just that we have got ourselves into a situation where we needed some of these restrictions. We should have never got ourselves into that situation. And now that we are thinking about removing some of these things, we need to do some thinking about how we're going to do it, and sort of definitely get off that these things and think about the next stage, which is trade liberalization, which we have been talking about for a long time, but we haven't really looked into.
Yeah, I think it's been a great discussion with you. Even I hope the audience got a good insight. Even I think learned quite a lot today. So really happy to have you here, Mathisha, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.